Here's a quick tour of the detectives and the hypotheses for how these Gospels ended up the way they are. Jesus' life and teachings were remembered by his disciples. Those memories were conveyed especially as apostolic preaching and teaching, eyewitness testimony, and oral traditions. Papias of Hieropolis was an early church historian who gave an account of how the Gospels were understood in the first few centuries of the church. In the Enlightenment, scholars backed away from Papias' accounts, but contemporary scholars like Richard Bauckham have helped recover some appreciation for the reliability of at least some of what Papias said. Among Papias' claims was that the Apostle Peter was responsible for much of the content of Mark's Gospel. Early church tradition, Augustine, for instance, in the 4th and 5th centuries, held that Matthew wrote first. After all, Matthew was one of the 12 apostles, and that Mark, who wasn't one of the 12 and wasn't an eyewitness, edited or redacted the Gospel of Matthew. This is called Mathian Priority, the conviction that Matthew wrote first. One scholar, Griesbach, claimed that Luke redacted Matthew, and then Mark had both Luke and Matthew on hand and redacted both. This theory still has its defenders, but it's really hard to explain why Mark would edit out stuff like the Sermon on the Mount, why Mark would introduce grammatical difficulties that aren't there in Matthew and Luke. Why would Mark take a sentence of Matthew that Jesus did very few miracles in his hometown and change it to say Jesus could do very few miracles in his hometown? Almost every biblical scholar today thinks it makes much more sense that Mark wrote first and that Matthew and Luke edited Mark and added some of their own material. This is called Markan priority, that Mark wrote first and that Luke and Matthew are drawing on Mark. The green arrows in this chart indicate direct literary dependence, obvious signs that Matthew is drawing on Mark, and equally obvious signs that Luke is drawing on Mark. But it begs the question why Matthew and Luke agree with each other in places where there's no material in Mark. There are two explanations. One is that Luke had both a copy of Mark and a copy of Matthew on hand. He's usually following Mark, and when Mark doesn't have anything, he's moving over to Matthew. The color orange here indicates possible influence. There's an orange arrow running from Matthew to Luke if Luke drew on Matthew. There's another orange arrow running from Mark to John because there are some signs that the Gospel of John assumes readers know the events and the sequence in the Gospel of Mark that aren't conveyed in John itself. There are details, for instance, about when John was imprisoned that you would know if you read the Gospel of Mark, but you wouldn't know if you only had John on hand. I'm putting the names of the four evangelists in quotes here because we're not sure that each is responsible for that gospel. The other hypothesis, trying to account for how Matthew and Luke agree with each other when they don't have Mark to draw on, is called the Q hypothesis. Q stands for the German word Quelle, for source. There's no existing manuscript of that source, so a number of scholars doubt it even exists. Think of it as a hypothetical document that includes the material you find in Matthew and Luke, but not Mark. I put dark orange arrows running from Q to indicate that if it exists, there are possible literary dependencies that would account for why Matthew and Luke agree. Of course, these writers aren't just making all this up, they're drawing on sources of their own, either oral or literary sources. So Papias has Mark recording from Rome Peter's memories and putting him in an orderly sequence to tell the story the way he wants. Luke mentions drawing on witnesses at the beginning of his gospel, eyewitnesses in fact, and Richard Bauckham has shown that even the Gospel of John, which has such a distinct voice, shows a lot of evidence of drawing on eyewitness testimony, as does Matthew. In fact, some of these witnesses might be the named figures in the Gospels, like Clopas, one of the two travelers on the way to Emmaus, whose name is supplied for historical credibility. Nowadays, a lot of academics favor what's called the two-source hypothesis, that both Luke and Matthew have two main direct literary sources, Mark and Q, and they would be drawing on other sources of their own. A further assumption of a lot of contemporary biblical scholars is that each of these Gospels reflects the influence of a particular community, living in a specific environment and having a specific theology. So I have gray arrows that go from each of these communities to its evangelist. The so-called Johannine community is responsible for shaping the oral traditions that end up in the Gospel of John. The so-called Lucan community is responsible for the traditions that end up in Luke, and so on. You'll note that on the left, the Gospel of John looks rather left out compared to all the arrows between Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Because it's so distinct, scholars will sometimes assume that it's reflecting a community with a pretty distinct take on Jesus and on the Gospel. You may have heard about the Gospel of Thomas. That's not in our New Testaments. It is a collection of sayings of Jesus, which wasn't respected in the early church, but which might have some historical value. Some of the sayings seem to come from a pretty early era. However, the text of Thomas is a 2nd century Gnostic text from a community that is outside the mainstream and outside the network of communicating churches that the apostles founded. So I don't give Thomas a lot of credibility. According to this assumption, even Q would have had a community. One of the problems with this assumption is that there's no evidence for it. It's just a sociological or anthropological assumption that was taken over in the early 20th century from anthropology and absorbed almost wholesale in biblical studies, sidelining, if not disregarding, the massive evidence for an apostolic network of churches that communicated and circulated and knew about each other's work. I keep bringing up Richard Bauckham because I find his work really helpful here. He's convinced me that there's not much evidence at all for discrete communities that are responsible for the shaping of each gospel. His book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, is far more successful in showing the role of eyewitness testimony in the presence of each gospel. So for what it's worth, not because you have to agree with me, but because you should probably know where I'm coming from, here's my working hypothesis as I introduce these 4 gospels. I won't be describing discrete communities, but I will be thinking in terms of witnesses that each evangelist is drawing on. I think the evidence for Mark and Priority is clear, and the evidence that Matthew and Luke are drawing on Mark is almost indisputable. I don't think there's much evidence for Q. I don't exclude the possibility, so I put it in black here as unlikely literary dependence, not impossible, but unlikely and really impossible to prove. And I put skinny black arrows between Q and Matthew and Luke, and a gold arrow between Matthew and Luke, suggesting possible, maybe even probable influence. Luke is getting material that's common to Matthew, and Luke begins his gospel by mentioning that he's consulted many sources, including sources from eyewitnesses. I also tend to trust Papias' testimony that Mark is probably drawing on Peter's memories. That helps explain why Peter and the apostles come off so poorly in the Gospel of Mark, because they are embarrassed at who they were in the process of being transformed by Jesus. So I've left the scare quotes off of Mark as the author of that gospel. I'm still not sure about Matthew and John. Luke seems like a pretty good guess, as I've already mentioned when discussing Acts. And I also have a slender gold arrow between Mark and John because I think it helps make sense of some of John's assumptions. I could see a slender gold arrow between Matthew and John as well, because there are some passages in Matthew that are strikingly similar to John. Those assumptions will be influential in my analysis of these Gospels, because I will be assuming that Matthew is drawing on Mark, but moving it in the direction he wants, that Luke is doing the same thing, and that John is doing something like the same thing, although not drawing on Mark so much as reacting to Mark. Whether or not you agree with my assumptions or even care about the literary relationships, I hope the way I treat it strengthens your awareness that each of these 4 Gospels has its own voice, its own literary character, and its own set of goals. The church wants to glue these things together and harmonize them so that we end up with a creche with half Matthew, half Luke, and there's a place for that. But what gets lost is Matthew's vision and Luke's vision. My top priority in introducing each gospel is that you hear that evangelist's voice, that you get what each gospel writer is so powerfully communicating, and that you value each one of these 4 in its own right. And that is what the church did when it circulated these 4 gospels and soon, informally and then formally canonized them as their 4 official stories of our Jesus. Let's look at some common themes in the 4 Gospels. We will also look at their distinctives. The Gospels affirm the content of the Old Testament and its apocalyptic perspective, at least the apocalyptic perspective that comes near the end of the Old Testament era. In fact, the coming of the kingdom doesn't just affirm the Old Testament, it transfigures it. Because the way that Jesus and his gospel collide with the various camps of first century Judaism shows that the scriptures and their perspective have been widely misconstrued, even universally misconstrued. Jesus doesn't just affirm the content of the scriptures, he fulfills them in ways that actually disappoint some of their champions. In fact, many of their champions, all of their champions. By the end of Jesus' career, the rejection is basically universal, minus a few in the remnant. By the end of Jesus' career, he has lost the crowds, he has lost the authorities if he ever had them, and he's lost one in his inner circle, and the rest have been scattered by his arrest. You see just how wrenching the collision is between how people interpret the scriptures and put their hope in God and God's Messiah, and what's actually arriving in Jesus. They are bitterly disappointed, and they end up shouting, "Crucify him." And that leads to the next big theme of all four Gospels, that Jesus' life, and especially his death, his crucifixion, and his resurrection, are a turning point in God's saving action for Israel and for the world through Israel. We see all of this in the New Testament letters, the basics of the gospel and the basic shape of the Christian faith, that not just Jesus' work, but Jesus' person himself reveals God and makes God's salvation newly available to Israel and all the earth. All four Gospels also portray a central role for Jesus' disciples, for his church, commissioned to bring the good news and the grace of the kingdom, not just to Israel, but to all nations. The difference between the Gospels and the letters is that the Gospels show you how this is happening at the very beginning, how Jesus is working with a band of disciples, converting their imaginations through his presence, his teaching, and especially his gracious patience with them as they stumble their way into the truth. The Gospels are like four editions of What I Saw at the Revolution, what I saw at the beginning of this process of remaking. The Gospels communicate these points as they should in different ways, for different audiences, with different voices. And the differences are delicious. But even as we look at the differences, I want you to appreciate the commonalities. This is a chorus of voices in a common mission and a common testimony.